Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for this panel discussion on criminalizing Islam, the Western European panel discussion. So why are MPACUK UK doing this event, Criminalizing Islam? The simplest and bluntest answer to this question is that we see normative Islamic practices being used as markers for extremism. What does that mean in plain English? It means that, for example, if a child expresses an Islamic opinion in school, he may be interviewed by police. It means that so-called counter-violent extremism or preventing violent extremism, CVE or PVE for short, these policies single out Muslims when they are applied on a national level. This event is the Western Europe panel and will be the first of a series, inshallah, as we track the spread of counter-violent extremism legislation and its subsequent impact on Muslims around the world. Case in point would be the UN Security Council Resolution 2178, which bound nations to CVE and PVE policies. As a community, we need to realize that we must be alert to the spread of these policies in other countries because they will end up on our own doorstep too. But we as Muslims should take heart too. If we can defeat such legislation in our own countries, not only have we stopped it here, but we can help and train other Muslims to tackle it elsewhere too. The saga begins in the Netherlands thanks to two key documents: Recruitment for the Jihad in the Netherlands, From Recruitment to Trends, and a memo titled Counter-Terrorism in the Netherlands. So we will start our discussion there. Before we start, we have some simple ground rules. The chat function is for any questions, which will be answered in the Q&A at the end, inshallah. The chat is not for provoking or responding to provocation. Anyone who breaks this simple rule will be removed. Questions from our Zoom audience will be prioritized. And if there's time, we will come to questions from our Facebook audience. To join in on Zoom at our next event, book a ticket on Eventbrite and look out for updates on our social media. And lastly, if you want to see more of these kinds of events, join our team as a volunteer. There will be links in the chat. I'll say Jazakallah khairan to Brother Yasser and all of our speakers for your patience. I realize it is late, but as I said before, we have a wealth of experience and expertise here. And we have with us Brother Yasser Louati. He is based in France. He is a human rights and civil liberties advocate, a community organizer and political analyst. He has been active since the mid-1990s and been a leading voice against racism and state authoritarianism in Europe and around the world. After years of grassroots activism and international campaigns out of Paris, Yasser founded the CJL, the Justice and Liberties for All Committee, which is a transnational human rights and civil liberties organization. Yasser is fluent in French, English, and Arabic, and is a regular contributor to international news outlets such as the BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, TRT, among others. It gives me great pleasure to host him in today's events, and he will help bring the discussion portion of this event to a close as he summarizes the situation across Europe, inshallah. Please, brother, go ahead.
Thank you, Ahmed, and thanks to all the speakers who spoke before me. All the analysis that we have been hearing so far has been spot on, and we have gathered so far a wealth of information in terms of how the law is mobilized to not only criminalize Muslims as potential terrorists or radicals to be watched over, but also to how to redefine what it means to be Muslim, and for Western governments, the UK, France, Belgium, Austria, etc., to further shrink the space in which they evolve and operate. Now, of course, we can speak hours, especially in the case of my country, about all the specific legislation passed to specifically target Muslims, the banning of the banning of Muslim visibility through various laws, the headscarf, the full face veil, the tracking of Muslim girls wearing long skirts, etc. Just before me, we spoke of the state of emergency. The ballpark figure given is around 4,000 raids, if not more. And 0.16% of those raids led to actual investigations on terror grounds, which means that it's not about effectiveness. And the answer to that is the objective was actually given by Gérald Darmanin in late 2019 when he said it's not about prosecuting them, it's about sending a message. We know we have nothing on those people, but it is about sending a message. And of course, every single time there is a terrorist attack, Muslims are held accountable for it. But the questions we never hear, and this is again, I'm been repeating myself, for years now, how come there is no auditing of the failures of domestic and foreign intelligence? There is a wealth of documentation on how French counterterrorism has failed. The same applies to the US, the UK, etc. But instead of confronting state failures, minorities are held accountable in order not only to shift public opinion from seeking accountability, but also to further legitimize extreme laws of repression. So we heard, of course, the SILT law of October 2017, which turned the supposedly exceptional state of emergency into permanent law. There has been almost a year-long controversy around the anti-separatism bill and now the anti-separatism law. But given the way France legislated against its Muslim segment of the population and how it has led, or it has actually developed an access with Belgium and with Brussels and Vienna in order to crack down on so-called political Islam. Now, of course, political Islam has never been clearly defined. And if you take a look at how it is applied, it means any Muslim person who is actively challenging the government, or any Muslim the government disagrees with, whether you are socially active, politically active, or if you dare to speak as a Muslim and of course dare to say no to the government. And we see that this is not isolated to the major capitals of the European continent. Of course, the UK was mentioned earlier, but the same thing is being applied in Denmark, the Czech Republic, in Slovenia, of course, Hungary, and the brutality with which Austria cracked down on its Muslim population. And we remember the raid faced by our brother, Dr. Farid Hafez, that has led to the ransacking of his house and the terrorizing of his wife and kids. We only have to ask ourselves, since 9/11, 2 decades have passed, and the drift has been ongoing for 2 decades, and we did not see any stop in this exceptional legislation. CAGE was set up in the aftermath of 9/11 and the Extraordinary Rendition Program, and other organizations were set up, the CCIF, for example, to name a few. Now, after 2 decades, what is the conclusion of what has been accomplished so far? And I'm going to be quite blunt, and I remind our listeners here, those who know me and those who don't, I belong to no political party. I am not financed by any other organization. What I do it for free, which means I am free to say what I think is the truth. I am not held by any political agenda. My sole objective is to uncover the truth and to promote justice and equality for all. Like it or leave it, my speech is free, and it might be shocking sometimes to say the blunt truth. Now, after 2 decades, we have seen Muslim organizations assess, call out, and expose government injustices and open repression against Muslims. The Muslims today are the Jews of yesterday. It is acceptable to say it today. It wasn't just a few days ago, but now that white people in the left are using it, maybe it is acceptable that the rhetoric being used against Muslims today is no different from that was being used against Jews yesterday. The enemy within was first applied to the Jews, the Judeo-Bolsheviks, etc. Today, the enemy within are Muslims. If you quote the former Prime Minister of France, Manuel Valls, he spoke of Islamofascism and a war against the enemy within. Now, we cannot, on the one hand, call states racists, openly Islamophobes. We cannot, for decades, year after year, constantly call out a specific law, constantly witness a drift to the far right, to the point that ideas that were on the fringe of the political spectrum all throughout the European Union, and now after Brexit, the UK, those theses were always considered traditionally extreme. Today, they are part of the mainstream. I remind our listeners that today I've seen the banning of the headscarf in France in schools, that in 1989, the highest administrative authority, the Council of the State, le Conseil d'État, actually ruled in favor of those grade school girls when they were wearing the headscarf. And the Council of the State stated clearly that you cannot discriminate between students. But notice how within 15 years, those who were on the fringe of the political spectrum became the mainstream within 15 years. Now, we are 20 years after 9/11. What happened? The worst is still to be expected. I remind our listeners and viewers that France, as the Bosnians were undergoing a genocide, stood with the Serbians. And when Bill Clinton confronted François Mitterrand about it, while Bosnian Muslims were facing a prohibition to buy weapons to defend themselves against the paramilitary troops of the Serbs and the Croats, what did François Mitterrand say? And what did the British say at the time? It is unfortunate, quote unquote, but this is the painful return to normality in Europe, that Bosnia, a Muslim country, does not belong in the heart of Europe. When you have governments witnessing the butchering of thousands of people, a genocide in Srebrenica, and you see them not only preventing those populations from defending themselves and at the same time actually being okay with their slaughtering, what else can be expected from those governments? So yes, honestly, it is our responsibility as public figures to tell people what ought to be heard, that it is not going to get better. And the reasons, of course, are, multiple. There is, of course, a need to further strengthen the grip of the state over its population. And because they cannot say, well, we need to surveil everybody and snoop on their conversations, we need to pass a law on mass surveillance to crack down on Muslim terrorists. That's what gave us in the US the Patriot Act, and that's what gave us the law on mass surveillance in France, passed in 2016. The state of emergency was unimaginable, but because the rhetoric adopted was constantly to protect the nation from these radical Muslims who are posing a dire threat to our identity, our culture, and our security, etc., we need a permanent state of emergency. So it has become normal for Muslims to be portrayed as the enemy within. Once laws are passed in the name of fighting a specific minority, the law applies to everyone. And as our respective countries, be it the UK, France, and other countries throughout the European Union, are facing potential violent social upheavals, governments in all these countries, they are passing these laws to actually further strengthen their legal, their repressive apparatus. And because they couldn't pass that against the majority population, you pass it against Muslims. Now, the common denominator that I have witnessed throughout either the UK, France, Denmark, and other countries is that oftentimes this repression is not done ex nihilo. There is always a transmission belt between the policymakers and the Muslim communities. And the transmission belt, well, are Muslim organizations. Why? Because in the case of France, when you have, for example, the CFCM that was okay with the very idea of the anti-separatism bill, and even was okay with the idea of having a contract, the infamous Charter of Imams that would police what can be said and cannot be said in mosques. That means that oftentimes mainstream Muslim organizations are the validators of these anti-Muslim policies. And this raises the question, how come these organizations still find a way to represent Muslims without a backlash within Muslim organizations? Now, of course, we do call out governments because they are anti-Muslim. We call racisme d'État in French, state racism in various countries. We got that. We have the colonial legacy. We have constant anti-Muslim controversies, feeding the hysteria bubble on social media, etc. Yes, but we have to also be blunt with ourselves. Why are they doing it? If you ask someone why, and his answer is because I can, the problem does not lie with him. The problem lies with you. Because if the French government, if the British government, if the German government, if the Belgian government, and now if the Quebec state are racist because of their colonial legacy, but they're only targeting Muslims or disproportionately targeting Muslims. Why is it so? It's because it is easy and there are no political consequences or no political repercussions to what they do. They don't target other minorities. They do sometimes, but most of the time it is Muslims who are being targeted. Why is it so easy to target Muslims? And what else can you expect from a racist government, if not racist legislation? Now, the pushback cannot be in terms of the legal struggle. I am not dismissing the legal work. It is fundamental. We need to have the same work that has been done by various organizations, what Sister Lelia has introduced in terms of following up with cases and victim support. But remember that politics is making the legal space shrink, which means as time passes, the surface on which you can actually work as lawyers, as counselors, etc., is diminishing year after year. What TNI based in Amsterdam called the notion of shrinking space. So that means you cannot only count on lawyers to do the legwork in terms of victims support. Remember that the law is always political and the law always reflects the power struggle in the halls of parliament. In most of our countries, we have two chambers, the lower and the higher chamber, and whatever the majority is, the law will reflect and will be an image or a mirror image of that National Assembly. So if we dismiss the political work and only count on the legal work, we are heading straight to the wall because they will constantly pass new laws. And as the brother from the Netherlands, mentioned, they will always find ways to criminalize without going before criminal courts. And that is not new. In the case of France, one more time, during the colonial repression against Algerians, Pétain, I forgot his name, the head of the police, Maurice Papon, who was head of the police back then, knew that if he were to prosecute Algerians through the court of law, it would take him weeks, if not months, if not years. So what he mobilized was administrative justice. And because the administrative justice will always, or most of the time, side with the government, it would be much easier to curtail people's rights. Now, we spoke of the governments and we spoke of Muslim organizations, but now let's look downwards how this repression against Muslims is working. I was shocked some years ago when I would travel to Eastern Europe to see how the UK and France have inspired those countries. And because of the weight of France and the UK in the UN and their supposed legitimacy in terms of speaking of human rights, minority rights, the rule of law, etc., other governments say, well, if France can do it, so can we. And that is the legitimation through the shining example of France as being the cradle for human rights. Now, I cannot take more time, but I have to wrap up. So we have now a definite tendency swooping across Europe. And please do not keep your hopes up in terms of seeing governments backtrack on policies that have been designed for the past 2 decades. Things are only going to get worse. Now the question is, what are we prepared to do as human rights activists, civil liberties advocates, members of civil society to confront that. As long as it is not in the interest of respective governments to backtrack, they will not do it. And this raises the question on how Muslim communities function, both at the national level, but also at the local level. I was shocked when I became familiar with the British Muslim landscape to see how imams were cooperating with the British government to implement the prevent provision. I was shocked. Honestly, I thought, we had it bad in France, but even in the UK, you would see imams that would shut the door to organizations, confronting anti-Muslim policies from the government, but they would welcome state officials and then act as their mouthpieces, join the military, report a person who is a radical, even though the radicalization, of course, has never been defined. And this will join, actually, I'm gonna throw a stone in the, in the showcase in terms of the functioning of Muslim organizations. What we have seen so far, and the French example should actually scare minorities all over Europe. When you see that the Grand Mosque of Paris drafted the most radical version of the Imam Charter, the so-called contract that would allow, or actually that would delimit what imams can say during their sermons. You can't call state Islamophobia. You have to praise the military. You cannot import foreign conflicts. And this is a direct reference to the occupation of Palestine and the Palestinian people's struggle for freedom. That did not come from the government. That came from the Grand Mosque of Paris, the historic organization representing Muslims. Now, call me a radical if you want. That's your problem and your choice. But a question, how is it that Muslims can complain about these institutions who throw them under the bus and still go to those mosques? How is it? Because the legitimacy of the Grand Mosque of Paris, well, it's a mosque in Paris. It cannot, by definition, represent all Muslims throughout France. Yet it is the prime institution towards which the government goes to validate its policies. The question is, how do Muslim communities function when there is no transparency, no accountability towards Muslim leaders? The Grand Mosque was not alone. The CFCM itself has been the validator of anti-Muslim policies since its inception, 2003 under Nicolas Sarkozy. And this again now brings the question of who represents Muslims. A sister before me from the Netherlands spoke of Dutch Muslims of the second, third, and fourth generation. It is the same thing in France, okay? It's a relatively new community. Explain to me how, after 3 generations, the representatives of Muslims are still foreign nationals. Explain to me how people who were born and raised in countries where there is no separation of religion and state, where Islamic institutions are there to validate and legitimize the dictatorships that are present in most Muslim countries, with a very few exceptions, okay, Turkey, Malaysia, Indonesia, where you have some form of free and fair elections, but all the rest of them are under tight dictatorships. How come Muslims in the Netherlands, France, maybe the UK to some extent, are still unable to have their own homegrown representatives? This is not a call for discrimination. I'm talking about the political culture adopted by many Muslim representatives, where in Muslim countries, the imam, the mufti, the preacher, whatever, is always subservient to the king, the rais, the president, whatever. And I forgot who mentioned the case of Egypt. The case of Egypt now presiding an institution that's going to now oversee counter-radicalization. Egypt that has been ruled by a dictator for the past almost decade. And I ask myself, what is it that keeps people so apathetic that they can, on the one hand, say the state is racist, witness the transmission belt of the state being their own Muslim organizations, and then allow people who are not legitimate to represent them to speak on their behalf? What if tomorrow I went to the UK or the Netherlands and I tell you guys over there, you know what, I'm going to represent you. I'm going to learn your language, spend some time, and then I'm going to represent you. What are you going to say? Yasser, we like you, but please stop, don't do it. You are illegitimate. And in the case of Western Muslims, you have to ask yourselves, how is it that there is no accountability, no transparency? And this brings us to the funding of mosques in Europe. A person before me complained, and this is not, throwing stones at her. I highly respect what she said, but I also express my disagreement when it comes to foreign funding of European mosques. Of course, I am not opposed to it for the same reasons as Western governments. Absolutely not. But when a foreign country funds a mosque, that means they have their say in how the mosque is managed, in what imams preach. And that means at the end of the day, how the mosque will represent or not the local community. Now explain to me, if a mosque in the southern suburbs of Paris is funded by the Kingdom of Morocco, don't you expect the Kingdom of Morocco to use that mosque for the purposes of promoting its own foreign agenda? Of course. Algeria, for example, the ambassador of Algeria last year declared the Grand Mosque of Paris is first Algerian. First Algerian. And at the same time, this organization says it represents French Muslims. And the list goes on. So what I call for, and Muslim communities around Europe are going through what other communities went through in the past century and the century before it, they also have to self-organize. Brother Ryan spoke of 46 million euros that have been seized by the French government for the past few years. Right, now, 46 million euros have been seized. And to this day, there is not a network of solidarity, a network of representation, a network that could organize Muslims from the grassroots up. Now, to finish, and I know I've been taking much of your time, and I really appreciate you listening tonight. Western governments are bound to continue these policies. It would be a lie to tell people, expect the better, we are going to fight. No, the tidal wave has been brewing for the past 2 decades, and it will only get worse. The anti-separatism bill has only normalized the wildest dreams of Islamophobes in the late 20th century. Now it is accomplished. Muslim organizations have been acting as the transmission belt. So Muslims have not only to confront governments, but also confront their own organizations. It's not sufficient to say, well, they don't represent us. Oh, yes, they do. They represent you, and they will speak on your behalf. The other one is, of course, a better functioning of the grassroots. Don't aim for something national. Begin to act locally. This is where you will see immediate results. Now, in my case, some fatwas were issued because I organized the local Muslim community, and by mobilizing voters, the socialist mayor, who was quite corrupt, was brought down. And the first opposition we faced, it was the local mosque, the local imam, who mobilized people against the organizing of Muslims at the grassroots level. So there is really questions to be asked. The last point, and I'm going to end here. These events cannot remain talking, or chat rooms. They have to lead to something concrete. They have to push people to leave their comfort zone and engage with one another. Muslims complain a lot of lack of representation or betrayal by public figures. Fine, But can you organize people who don't trust one another? Of course, it is impossible. And as long as Muslim communities allow others to speak on their behalf, and as long as they are expect political charity from the government, unfortunately, they were gonna go from bad to worse. And of course, the best is yet to come. For Muslim communities are no different. It's just a matter of better organizing and existing politically. Thank you for listening.
Jazakumullah khairan, Brother Yasser. I want to pick up on that quote that you mentioned near the start about sending a message. Well, the individuals that you've heard here today, and especially Brother Yasser, they are sending a message, of course, to the government and the politics and the parties that all have a stake in legitimizing the institutionalization of Islamophobia. But as a summary of this event, you could also say that we are also, each of us, sending a message to our own communities, exactly as Brother Yasser said, in terms of we are fed up with the misrepresentation of the Muslim community in them being a conveyor belt for the continuation of Islamophobia in our communities. And I thank every speaker who has stayed on with us, with the most grateful. Jazakumullah khairan. May Allah reward you with better. We will end the live stream there.